In the last lecture, we began to explore the criteria that historians use to determine which of the surviving traditions about Jesus can be accepted as historically reliable. We saw that the earliest sources are, as a rule, more likely to be historically accurate. In effect, this means that Q and Mark, for example, are more likely to present a historically reliable picture than, say, John and Thomas. We also saw that we need to be able to be alert to theological developments and other biases that are reflected in our sources, including, of course, even our earliest ones, which are not themselves disinterested accounts of Jesus' life. We then examined one of the specific criteria that scholars have devised for studying the early traditions of Jesus, the criterion of independent attestation, which states that any tradition that is multiply attested in more than one independent source has a greater claim to authenticity than a tradition found in only one source. In discussing this criterion, we saw that the historian can be compared to a prosecuting attorney who needs to establish a case and to present evidence about what really happened. This analogy will continue to be fruitful for us as we consider in this lecture two other criteria that have been devised for studying these materials. First, the criterion of dissimilarity, and second, the criterion of contextual credibility. The most controversial criterion that historians use, and often misuse, to establish authentic tradition from the life of Jesus is sometimes called the criterion of dissimilarity. How can the criterion be explained by our analogy of a legal case? Any witness in a court of law will naturally tell things the way he or she sees them. Thus, the perspective of the witness has to be taken into account when trying to evaluate the merits of a case. Moreover, sometimes a witness has a vested interest in the outcome of the trial. A question that perennially comes up then involves the testimony of interested parties. Are they distorting or even fabricating testimony for reasons of their own? If I were arrested for arson and my own mother was put on the witness stand and testified under oath that she had seen me do it, all things being equal, her testimony would carry more weight than if she provided me with a convenient alibi. One needs to consider the vested interests of the witness, and if the testimony goes against their vested interests, then their testimony is more likely to be accurate. The analogy, of course, doesn't completely work for ancient literary sources. Authors from the ancient world were not under oath to tell the historical facts and nothing but the facts. But when examining ancient sources, the historian must always be alert to the perspective of the witness. This is particularly the case when dealing with sources that describe events from the life of Jesus. We know that early Christians modified and invented stories about Jesus. Everyone agrees with this. Otherwise, they would have to think that when Jesus was a 5-year-old, he really did make clay pigeons come to life, and that when he was raised from the dead, he really did emerge from his tomb with his head reaching up above the clouds as tall as a skyscraper. Nobody thinks these things, at least nobody that I know, which means that everybody thinks that somebody made up these stories. These stories are in Christian sources. This means that Christians were inventing stories about Jesus. How do we know which stories Christians invented and which ones are historically accurate? We have other cases in which we have two Gospels that tell the same story, but there are differences between them. How do we know which, if either of the two accounts, is the accurate one? We have to have a criterion. The criterion of dissimilarity is designed to show which stories were invented or transformed by the Christians and which ones are historically authentic. The first step in applying the criterion is to determine what the early Christians were trying to say about Jesus. and to ascertain whether the traditions told about his own sayings and deeds clearly support these Christian views. If traditions do support the views of the early Christians, then at least there's a theoretical possibility that these sayings and deeds were made up precisely in order to advance the views that some Christians held dear. But what if a saying or deed attributed to Jesus does not obviously support a Christian cause, or even works against it? A tradition of this kind would evidently not have been made up by a Christian. Why then would it be preserved in the tradition? Perhaps because it really did happen that way. The criterion of dissimilarity, then, maintains that any tradition about Jesus that does not support a clear Christian agenda, or that appears to work against the vested interests of the Christians telling the stories, is more likely to be historical. Before illustrating this criterion with a number of examples, I should be clear about several of its limitations. Just because a saying or deed of Jesus happens to conform to what Christians were saying about him does not mean that it cannot be accurate. Obviously, the earliest disciples followed Jesus precisely because they appreciated the things that he said and did. They certainly would have told stories about him that included such things. Thus, on the one hand, the criterion may do no more than cast a shadow of doubt on certain traditions. For example, a number of the traditions in the infancy Gospel of Thomas appear to be drawn from later Christian imagination. And some of the sayings in the Coptic Gospel of Thomas show Jesus supporting a kind of Gnostic theology, which in these traditions we'd have to say that it does not appear that Jesus is representing what a Jewish rabbi of the first century would have said. That is, it appears that these traditions coincide with what the Christians who were telling the stories wanted to say, and therefore they're not above suspicion. The criterion of dissimilarity, though, is best used not in the negative way of showing what Jesus did not say or do, but in the positive way of showing what he likely did say or do. This criterion, then, is best used to show what probably does go back to Jesus, better than showing that what probably does not go back to Jesus. Again, the best way to clarify how the criterion works is by showing it in action, by looking at several examples. And so I'm going to give you a list of examples. I've got 5 traditions that I want to look at that seem to me to pass the criterion of dissimilarity. The first is one we've already looked at, the tradition of Jesus' association with John the Baptist. In some of our traditions, Jesus is said to have been baptized by John the Baptist. Scholars have long recognized that this is not the kind of tradition that a believer in Jesus would probably have made up, since it was widely assumed in early Christianity that a person who was baptized was spiritually inferior to the one who's doing the baptism. In other words, the person who is baptizing another is the spiritual superior. But in this tradition, it's John the Baptist baptizing Jesus. What Christian would make up the tradition that Jesus was spiritually inferior to John the Baptist? Well, probably none. That means it probably goes back to Jesus' life itself. Evidence for this, in fact, is preserved in one of our Gospels, the Gospel of Matthew, in which there is evidence of the Christians' embarrassment over this baptism tradition. In a tradition found only in Matthew, there's a little discussion that goes on between Jesus and John prior to the baptism. Jesus shows up to be baptized, and John, this is Matthew chapter 3, verses 14 and 15, John wants to prevent him, saying that I need to be baptized by you, but do you come to me? Jesus answered him, let it be so now, for it's proper for us in this way to fulfill all righteousness. Then he consented. This tradition of John's reluctance to baptize Jesus is found only in Matthew. It's not multiply attested. It does not pass the criterion of dissimilarity because it shows precisely the point of view that the Christians would have had. Namely, why would John baptize Jesus? Shouldn't it be the other way around? Since Christians would not want to show that Jesus was spiritually inferior to John, they wouldn't have invented the tradition that he was baptized by John. Therefore, the tradition probably actually goes back to Jesus' life. This is a kind of tradition that almost all scholars accept as being historically reliable because it passes the criterion of dissimilarity. An even clearer example involves the end of Jesus' life, his crucifixion. The crucifixion of Jesus is not a tradition that Christians would have been likely to have made up. Why not? We have a number of Jewish sources from the first century and preceding centuries that talk about what the Messiah would be like. Christians, of course, believed Jesus was the Messiah, and they tried to convince Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. The Jewish sources that describe the coming Messiah have a variety of ways of understanding what the Messiah would be. In some of our sources, the Messiah is understood to be a future king of Israel, a political leader, a military warrior who would overthrow the enemies of Israel and set up God's kingdom in Jerusalem where he himself would be the king. He would be a king like David, who ruled over Israel as a sovereign state, who would be a powerful warrior who would establish God's kingdom there in Jerusalem. That's one tradition. Another tradition about the future Messiah understood him not in these kind of political terms, but in more spiritual or cosmic terms. The Messiah was thought to be a kind of judge who is coming from heaven in order to judge the earth, to overthrow the forces of evil that were aligned against God, and to set up God's kingdom in a cosmic act of power. Other Jews expected a Messiah who would be a powerful priest figure, who would be empowered by God to interpret his law and would lead the people through his interpretation of the Torah of Moses. There are a variety of expectations of what the Messiah would be like, but there's one thing that holds all of these expectations together. All of the Jewish expectations of the Messiah that we know about portray him as a future figure of grandeur and power. So far as we know, there were no Jews prior to Christianity who thought that the Messiah was going to suffer and die. Suffering and death were not the Messiah's mission. Only when Christians came along and said that Jesus was the Messiah did there emerge the idea of a suffering Messiah. And the logic is quite plain. The logic is that Jesus, if he's the Messiah, shows us that the Messiah has to suffer and die because Jesus suffered and died. But that wasn't the expectation. The expectation was that the Messiah would be a figure of grandeur and power. Most Jews thought that it was a scandalous notion that the Messiah would be crucified. Most Jews simply did not accept the Christian proclamation about Jesus as the Messiah because it cut against everything they believed about the Messiah. That's why the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 says that the crucifixion of Jesus is the major stumbling block for Jews accepting the gospel. Why would Christians have invented the story of Jesus being crucified if it was the biggest obstacle to having people convert? Well, they wouldn't. If they wanted to make up stories about Jesus as the Messiah, they would have made up a story that Jesus, in fact, stormed into Jerusalem, drove out the Romans, and established the kingdom there. They couldn't make up that story because everybody knew it wasn't true. They had to tell the story of Jesus' crucifixion because it actually happened. They wouldn't have made up the story. And so the second example that clearly passes the criterion of dissimilarity is Jesus' crucifixion. Third example, more briefly. It seems unlikely that Christians would have invented the multiply attested story that Jesus was betrayed by Judas, one of his own followers. Jesus was betrayed by one of his own 12? Doesn't that seem to show that Jesus didn't have power and authority even over those who were closest to him? That story does not appear to be the sort of thing somebody would have made up. because it might suggest that Jesus was somewhat lacking in authority and power. Where then did the story come from? Well, it must be something that actually happened. Fourth example. The criterion of dissimilarity can sometimes be applied to specific sayings of Jesus. As one example, Mark chapter 8, verse 38. Jesus is talking to his disciples right in the middle of Mark's gospel. And he tells them, "Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." Whoever is ashamed of me, of that one, the Son of Man will be ashamed when he comes in the clouds of heaven. The early Christians, of course, thought that Jesus himself was the Son of Man who was coming back in judgment over the earth. There were sayings in the Gospels in which Jesus talks about the Son of Man, and he's clearly talking about himself. Well, Christians thought he was the Son of Man, and they're the ones who preserved these sayings of Jesus. What about a saying like Mark 8:38, where there's no indication at all that Jesus is talking about himself? If you didn't know that Jesus was the Son of Man and you heard this saying, you would assume just the opposite, that Jesus is saying, however anybody reacts to me is how the Son of Man, the future judge, will react to that person. In other words, it doesn't appear to be the kind of saying that a Christian would make up because there's not a clear identification of Jesus as the Son of Man in this saying. That makes it appear that Jesus actually said something like Mark 8:38. Fifth, final example, deals not with an individual saying, but with a extended parable that I think probably is something that Jesus himself actually said. This is a famous parable in Matthew chapter 25, the parable of the sheep and the goats, where Jesus is talking about what will happen at the end of time when the Son of Man comes. Again, not apparently identifying himself as this Son of Man. It's a terrific parable. Jesus says, when the Son of Man comes in his glory, all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He'll put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at his left. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, he'll say to the sheep, "Come, you who are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom that's prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? When was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me." He goes on then and speaks to the people on his left side and sends them accursed into the eternal fire that was prepared for the devil and his angels because they didn't help him out when he was sick or naked or in prison or hungry. What is striking about this story is that it indicates that the way a person has salvation is by doing good things for people in need. Well, that's perfectly fine. What is most interesting, though, is that the people who tend to those who are in need are actually tending to the needs of Jesus. The people doing this don't realize anything about Jesus. Lord, when did we ever see you naked or hungry or thirsty or in prison? Would a Christian have made up a story that indicates that it's by doing good deeds that a person has eternal life? Well, in fact, the early Christians we know about thought that the way a person has eternal life is by believing in the death of Jesus and in his resurrection. The early Christians were quite adamant that salvation came not on the basis of good deeds, but on the basis of faith in Jesus' death and resurrection. These people, who are described as having eternal life, though, don't have any faith at all in Jesus' death and resurrection. They don't even know who Jesus is. Would a Christian have made up that story? Well, it seems unlikely. Conclusion, this is a story that probably goes back to the historical Jesus. There are other sayings and deeds of Jesus which obviously do not pass the criterion of dissimilarity. As I've indicated, this in itself doesn't mean that these sayings and deeds don't go back all the way to Jesus. It just means that we can't use the criterion to show that they did. And anyone who wants to argue that a tradition is historical, of course, has to bear the burden of proof. And so if you want to argue that something goes back to Jesus, you have to demonstrate it. Let me give you a couple of examples of traditions that don't pass the criterion. 3 times in Mark's gospel, Jesus predicts that he must go to Jerusalem, be rejected, and then be executed and raised from the dead. Well, does this pass the criterion of dissimilarity? No, that's exactly what the Christians were saying about Jesus, that he knew full well ahead of time what was going to happen to him. He was going to be rejected, he's going to be crucified, then he's going to be raised from the dead. It's possible that since this is exactly what the Christians were saying about Jesus, that they put these words on his lips. It's possible. Or in the Gospel of John, Jesus claims to be equal with God. At one point in John's Gospel, he says, I and the Father are one. We don't find this tradition in the other Gospels, and it certainly does not pass the criterion of dissimilarity, because this claim of Jesus coincides perfectly well with what Christians were saying about him near the end of the first century when John's Gospel was written. These kinds of traditions may strike us as suspect in view of the criterion of dissimilarity. But in any event, we cannot use this criterion to show that they go back to Jesus because they coincide with what the Christians were saying about him. In sum, historians have to evaluate all of the traditions about Jesus so as to determine whether they coincide with the beliefs and practices of the early Christians who were proclaiming them, so as to make some kind of judgment concerning their historical reliability. One of the problems inherent in this criterion, as you may have guessed, is that we don't know very much about what the early Christians believed and practiced in terms of kind of their overall beliefs and practices. We know a lot about parts of it, but we don't have a total picture at all. That means it's somewhat hard to apply a criterion which presupposes that we do know a lot about what Christians believed and practiced. We know some things, but not everything we'd like. Moreover, what we do know indicates that Christians believed and practiced a whole range of things. There was a lot of variety in early Christianity. For these reasons, it's easier to make a judgment concerning a particular tradition when it passes both of the criteria we've discussed, independent attestation and dissimilarity. And the judgment can be made yet more easily when a tradition passes the third criterion as well, the criterion of contextual credibility. The criterion of contextual credibility is rooted in the necessity we have of understanding Jesus' own context for determining which traditions can be reliably attributed to him. The logic of the principle, again, can be explained in terms of a judicial proceeding. In a court of law, the testimony of a witness will not hold up under cross-examination if it does not coincide with the facts of the case. The same applies to historical documents. If you were to discover an ancient document that has a date written on it, and the date is written on it as 250 BC, well, you'd know that there was a problem. For ancient documents, reliable traditions must conform to the historical and social context to which they relate. For the traditions of the Gospels, this means that the sayings, deeds, and experiences of Jesus have to be plausibly situated in the historical context of first century Palestine in order for them to be trusted. Any saying or deed that does not make sense in this context is automatically suspect. Since this principle should be fairly obvious, I'll illustrate it simply by giving a couple of examples. There are traditions that we've talked about already that clearly do not pass the contextual, the criterion of contextual credibility. For example, in the Coptic Gospel of Thomas, we saw this saying where Jesus said that you will see the Son of Man when you take off all your clothes as children and throw them on the ground and trample on them. The saying makes perfect sense in the context of the 2nd century, when the Gnostic myth was floating around that can elucidate what the saying might mean. It's much harder to know what that saying might mean on the lips of a 1st century rabbi in Palestine. The second example, we've seen a tradition in the Gospel of Peter that it was the Jewish King Herod who had Jesus executed rather than the Roman governor Pilate. Well, this doesn't conform with what we know otherwise about how the Romans administered their provinces, including the province of Judea, during the days of Jesus. And therefore, this tradition that it's the Jewish king, Herod, who has Jesus crucified, doesn't pass the criterion. Or another example. This one is one that we haven't looked at before. One of the best-known conversations of Jesus in the New Testament is in John chapter 3. John is talking with the rabbi Nicodemus, and he tells Nicodemus, Nicodemus comes up to him and he says, we know that you're a teacher of God because of the many signs you do. And Jesus says, truly I tell you, no one will see the kingdom of heaven unless he is born anew, or again, or from above. I say or because there's a Greek word involved that's ambiguous in meaning. Jesus says, in the Greek text it says, a person won't see the kingdom of heaven unless they are born anothen. That's the word, anothen. Now, Nicodemus himself doesn't understand what Jesus means. He says, well, how can I be born a second time? I can't crawl back into my mother's womb to be born. And Jesus says, truly I tell you, unless a person is born of water and spirit, they cannot see the kingdom of heaven. And then the conversation proceeds. The way this whole entire dialogue goes in John's Gospel, John chapter 3, is that Nicodemus misunderstands an ambiguous term that Jesus uses, anothen, and then Jesus explains the way he really meant it. Nicodemus thought that the word anothen meant you must be born a second time, and he wondered how that was possible. Jesus really meant you must be born from above, meaning you have to have a spiritual birth to coincide with your physical birth if you want to see the spiritual kingdom of heaven. In other words, the word anothen means two basic things, either from above or a second time. Nicodemus understands it one way, Jesus means it the other way, and the dialogue is predicated on the misunderstanding of this ambiguous term. Well enough. Well, that makes sense when you're reading the Gospel of John in Greek. Unfortunately, if Jesus and Nicodemus were having this conversation in Jerusalem, they would have been having it in Aramaic. Jesus spoke Aramaic. It was the language spoken in Jerusalem, and Nicodemus himself is a Jewish rabbi who would have spoken Aramaic. The problem is that in Aramaic, the word for a second time does not also mean from above. It's an ambiguity that is based on the Greek word, but they wouldn't have been speaking Greek. What does that mean? Well, it means that if this conversation took place, then it did not take place as it's described in the Gospel of John, which presupposes that it happened in Greek. Unlike the other two criteria we've looked at, the criterion of contextual credibility serves a strictly negative function. The two criteria of independent attestation and dissimilarity are used to argue for a tradition, on the grounds that it's attested by two or more independent sources, or that it was a story that Christians would not have invented. The criterion of contextual credibility, though, is used to argue against a tradition, on the grounds that it does not conform to what we know about from the historical and social context of Jesus' life. In conclusion, given the nature of our sources, we need to apply a set of rigorous criteria in order to determine what actually happened in Jesus' life. We know that Christians were modifying and inventing stories about Jesus, and that our written sources preserve both historically reliable information and theologically motivated accounts. For these reasons, traditions that we can most rely on as historically accurate are those that are independently attested in a number of sources, that do not appear to have been created to fulfill a need in the early Christian community, and that make sense in a first-century Palestinian context. Finally, I should emphasize that with respect to the historical Jesus, or indeed with respect to any historical person, the historian can do no more than establish historical probabilities. In no case can we reconstruct the past with absolute certitude. All that we can do is take the evidence that happens to survive and determine to the best of our abilities what probably happened. In the next lecture, I'll further illustrate how we can establish probabilities with respect to Jesus' life by applying these various criteria we've discussed to the traditions about his birth and his early life.